Friends, this time last year, I was proud to support Liz Kendall to be leader of our party. And I'm still proud of her. But how much has changed since that first hustings here at Progress Conference? Tristram Hunt's slot in the lineup was eventually taken by another candidate. Sadiq Khan has been elected as Mayor of London. I genuinely think I could clap all day about that. And because Sadiq's victory against a vile, racist, Tory attack tells us so much about how to win. If your opponents are in the gutter, do not be deterred. Because name-calling and backbiting tells the public that you've got no ideas and you don't know how to help them. And that goes for Ken Livingstone as well. Instead, the future belongs to those who are prepared to think beyond their backyard and give everyone in our country, rich or poor, black, white, gay, straight, disabled or not, of any faith or none, a place to be and a part to play. That's the Labour way. Meanwhile, over the last year, the Tories have succeeded in demonstrating what a Conservative government actually means for our country. The pulling apart of civil society, best exemplified by the Trade Union Bill, replacing hope with neglect by making cuts that mean people sleeping rough has become situation normal on our streets again, and the shame that burns because Tory ministers look away as refugee children sleep alone in Europe with no British arm extended to bring them home. Friends, a Labour government is required. And that's why Progress is the organisation for Labour members who want to campaign for Labour governments. Progress is a group of people who believe that Labour values lead us to be ambitious for our country and its citizens, and Progress, above all else, is an organisation at the heart of the Labour Party, and that's why the leader of the Labour Party is here. Back in September, I may have supported one candidate, but every candidate said something that I really agreed with. For Jeremy, he said we needed an open and thorough debate, straight-talking, honest politics. Well, for that, he's come to the right place. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thanks a lot. Comrades, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be at my first ever Progress conference. Straight talking, honest politics, I think I've heard that somewhere before. It is my first time speaking here. In fact, it's the first time I've ever been invited to a Progress conference, and I must say, you set a pretty high bar if you have to be elected leader of the party before you get invited here. So I'm most grateful to you. And last summer, we had 41 hustings events with Andy, Yvette and Liz, and dozens of conferences, and lots of meetings and rallies, and this is completing the set of all those events. And I have to say, thank you very much to Andy, Yvette and Liz for the way in which all those hustings were conducted and the way in which we were able to have good debate. Obviously, there were areas of disagreement, but we managed to get along personally very well indeed, and that is a very important thing in any political party, particularly our party, the Labour Party. Thank you, Alison, for what you said this morning, and Richard for inviting and welcoming me here today to the TUC. I've been in this hall many, many times over many years. I first came in here as a young trade unionist in the 1970s. I want also to call out and say thank you very much to two people. Kezia Dugdale for her campaign in Scotland, in the election campaign there. I don't know if Kezia's still here at the moment, but I have been in touch with her, obviously, frequently during campaigning with her in Scotland and since the election in Scotland. And I want to thank her for the way in which she conducted the campaign and the radical manifesto that Labour in Scotland put forward, which does challenge austerity, does challenge the SNP imposed austerity on local government and so much else in Scotland, and the fact that we did gain some territorial seats, and obviously the result overall isn't good. We all know that very well. But as a party, we're going to be there with them in Scotland, campaigning as long as it takes to ensure that we do help to bring real social justice to the people of Scotland through the Scottish Labour Party. And I want also to say thank you to the party in Wales and to Corbyn for the results that they achieved. And whilst there was a most peculiar election result I've ever seen in the election of Chief Minister last week, talk about strange alliances, my goodness, I hope that will now be resolved and that we will once again, we're obviously going to have a Labour government in Wales, but I hope it will be able to work effectively. That Labour government in Wales has brought good jobs for a lot of young people, has invested a great deal in education, has ended the internal market in the health service and provided children with breakfasts and school meals, which they absolutely need in order to be able to achieve in school. So congratulations to the party in Wales for once again ensuring there is a Labour government in Wales. I want to talk today about other things that have been said in the wake of last week's election results. It's been said the Labour movement can only improve people's lives by winning elections. It's absolutely true. We have to win elections and we have to fight as hard as we can. Later today, I'm speaking at a rally about voting to remain within the European Union in order to reform it, to make a real difference to people's lives. I think it's important that we do challenge in the European referendum the issues of injustice across Europe, the issues on which the European Union has not done so well, but the issues that it has done well, such as the Working Time Directive, such as holiday arrangements, such as anti-discrimination legislation, such as environmental regulation, in which it's done extremely well. The reform part has to remain part of it. Progressives must never be satisfied with the status quo, which is why last Wednesday I raised several times with the Prime Minister the issue of the Posting of Workers Directive. This is a crucial piece of legislation, a proposal from the Commission to stop the exploitation of workers from one nation to another and the undercutting of workers in another nation. It is a most divisive and horrible process that goes on that creates unbelievable levels of tension in many communities, not just in Britain, but in other parts of the world, as unscrupulous employers move exploited labour from one jurisdiction to another in order to try and undercut wage agreements, trade union agreements, and all the rest of it. We have to get support for the Posting of Workers Directive to stop this level of exploitation and build a unity of people rather than a disunity of people across Europe. We also have to unite together to resist any attempt by the Tories, which may come next Wednesday, on the repeal of our Human Rights Act, which was passed in the 1990s, or to pull out of the European Convention of Human Rights, which Labour has been signed up to since the very beginning. That Convention on Human Rights is a very important convention. It's guaranteed us a lot of rights in this country. It's guaranteed many rights, anti-discrimination rights, non-discrimination against lesbian and gay people, bisexual people, transgender people. It's been a very, very important convention. If we walk away from it as a country, we're in no position to criticise any other country anywhere in the world that walks away from its conventions. Human rights are a universal concept, not just a national concept. It's something I'm not sure the Tories fully understand. We won several victories on the 5th of May. Labour councils in places such as Crawley, Southampton, Hastings, Nuneaton and Bedworth, and newly won Labour councils in Bristol and Lancaster will improve people's lives. They were very important victories. And the Labour mayors that were elected in Salford and Liverpool, which I campaigned for and with them to ensure we helped to ensure that we got those results, and particularly also in London and Bristol. And I congratulate Sadiq Khan on his magnificent victory in London. I've been involved in every election in London ever since the 1970s, and this was the one that had the highest turnout I've ever seen for a local election in many inner city areas. And why was that turnout so high? Because people wanted something different in London. They wanted the issues in London to be addressed, but above all, it was a total rejection of the dog whistle politics of the Tory party, of what Linton Crosby was doing, of a way of festering racist tensions between people in London that was utterly rejected by the people of London. I'm very proud of the result we all achieved there. I also spent a lot of time campaigning in Bristol. I've been there many times over the past 6 months to support Marvin Rees as our candidate for Mayor of Bristol. And if you think of the history of Bristol and the slave trade and everything else that goes to the history of Bristol and the magnificence of Bristol and the unity of the people of Bristol, electing Marvin as the mayor was an incredible achievement. Congratulations to him, to the party and the people of Bristol. And the joy that was there last Saturday evening when we were celebrating Marvin's victory was something to behold. That is a victory we can all savour, as is Sadiq's. Those victories bring communities and people together, but also challenge what this government is doing on its lack of effective planning on transport issues on a regional basis, and crucially, the way that it is disregarding the housing needs of people in all of our big cities. These are mayors, the 4 mayors that we can work with to try and develop a housing policy that we can put into operation as a Labour government in 2020. Our party was founded by trade unions. They are the centre of the Labour movement. They improve people's lives every day by standing up for working people, ensuring employers do not get a free rein. That's why the Tories want to shackle them with their very draconian trade union bill. One of my first jobs on behalf of the Garment Workers Union, then known as the National Union of Tailors and Garment Workers Union, now part of the GMB, was as a lowly research official within the union, sitting in Companies House, reading company documents to chase down directors and employers who had systematically not paid or underpaid staff, or mysteriously and conveniently gone into bankruptcy just before a holiday period when money was owed to our members. Very interesting, and we got an awful lot of that back, and it were mostly women workers that benefited from it. That is the day-to-day detailed work that trade unions always do, that lay reps do. That was in the 1970s, and things have moved on a lot since then. But never forget, the bedrock of our movement is the trade union movement, our people, locally elected representatives, representing their members in the best way that they can. But there are big issues as well. Just this week, it was exposed that there are 209,000 jobs in Britain today not paying the national minimum wage. 209,000 people being illegally underpaid. There are 313,000 people, the equivalent of a city the size of Cardiff, who are still owed £68 million due to breaches since 1999. Legislation is important, but it's also ensuring that that legislation is effectively enforced by both public enforcement agencies as well as the work of trade unions. John McDonnell said, and I quote, "This is a government that is cutting in work benefits for the low paid, attacking trade union rights and cutting the staffing numbers of HMRC that are the people supposed to enforce the minimum wage. It was us, a Labour government, that won the landslide election in 97 that introduced the minimum wage. But it's trade unions day in, day out that have enforced it better than everyone." As I said thank you. And it was actually one of the proudest days of my political life when we actually got the minimum wage legislation passed. Because I remember the genesis of the minimum wage legislation. Yes, it was the wages boards from before the First World War and after it. It was industry-wide agreements, but it was also my union at that time, the National Union of Public Employees, and I remember the debate within the union about bringing in the idea of a national minimum wage. We eventually won it here in this place, the TUC, and the Labour Party conference, and it became legislation. Democracy in action of our movement. But passing legislation is only one part of that process. As we know our movement's proud history, and fighting discrimination, changing laws is one thing. Changing minds and changing attitudes and cultures is an ongoing struggle, and never becoming complacent. That we don't have to defend the gains that we have made. If you don't defend the gains you've made, they disappear altogether. They disappear through lethargy and inaction. That is why we need a strong labour movement. That is why we need very strong trade unions. As we campaign to change the agenda, we campaign to support politicians who take up our agenda and drive it into law, and campaign to make those changes stick afterwards. But it's the campaigning beforehand that makes that change possible. The campaigning is spurred by injustice. Injustice needs to be organised against. That is what our movement is about. Not just the labour movement, but it's what all progressive social movements exist and do in the world, to organise to change the world. A successful Labour Party, a successful labour movement also reaches out to those many social movements that want to achieve change. Think of some of the big issues of the past few decades. The poll tax was a ludicrous concept by any stretch of the imagination, experimented on in Scotland and eventually forced down the throats of the rest of the country. It was eventually defeated by the resistance of many people, students to pensioners in virtually every town and every part of the UK, and Labour councillors, some of whom refused to pay that unjust tax and paid some penalties as a result of it. The poll tax was eventually defeated. Think also to solidarity movements that have existed on a global scale. The horror of apartheid in South Africa grew from the election of the National Party to government in 1948. The horrors of apartheid, of Sharpeville, of the Rivonia treason trials, of the killing of Steve Biko and so many others, was seen on the stage of the rest of the world eventually through solidarity action and solidarity movements. Solidarity movements around the world didn't defeat apartheid on their own. That was largely done by the people of South Africa. But it was those acts of solidarity that made a difference and mattered. Many campaigned to persuade our party and our movement to take it very seriously and campaign on it, and we did just that. Look at also, nearer to home, historic injustices that have taken place. The Hillsborough families finally gained a degree of justice with the inquest that concluded 10 days ago. They faced down a combination of government, police and media establishments. They were lied to, they were smeared, their stories were traduced all around the place. They stuck together as a unit and as a community, and particularly the people of Merseyside stuck together with them, and eventually they gained a historic victory with the decision that came from the court. We as a party and a movement have to recognise that and understand that, but also understand that some of the victories we've achieved in the past, such as at the end of the Guildford and Birmingham campaigns, Guildford 4 and Birmingham 6 campaigns, we did get the Criminal Cases Review Board set up. We need to review all those processes so there is equality of access to justice for all people, so there isn't an automatic imbalance where the state and the establishment protect themselves and the communities that have suffered have no such recourse to funds that those people have. It's a fundamental. There has to be equality of access to justice, and that is something I'm very determined to achieve. Think too of the steelworkers and the campaign they're fighting through their unions, Community Unite and the GMP. The campaigning done by our steel industry MPs, by our MEPs like Jude Curtin-Darling and others, and front benchers John McDonnell and Angela Eagle, the work they've done. Our campaigning has forced the government to back down, has forced the government to agree, a Tory government to agree to take a stake in the new company that will be running the steel industry in Britain. That didn't happen for no reason. That happened because of the steadfastness of the unions, the MPs, what we're doing in Parliament, the communities in the steel industry towns who are determined that the steel industry will continue in this country and it will be the bedrock of the manufacturing base of industry in this country. That is why it's so important. Please continue to stick with the steel unions and the communities until we've seen the light at the end of the tunnel and a guarantee of the continuation of the steel industry throughout this country. But injustice continues, and it's the Labour movement inside and outside Parliament and social movements that will stand up and make things change. Think for a moment of the injustice and insecurity now faced by both retired and current workers at BHS and Austin Reed, because the super rich are allowed to treat companies employing thousands of workers and paying pensions to thousands of retired workers like pieces on a monopoly board. We have to have legislation and a political process that's strong enough to stand up to the systematic tax evaders and tax avoiders that destroy pension funds, livelihoods and jobs, and end up with low-paid jobs on insecure contracts. It's our job to ensure there's legislation to protect those people. And on a wider scale, human rights, I mentioned before, is absolutely crucial. It has to be, I think, the centrepiece of our foreign policy. We, as a party, took part in and supported the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the UN in the post-war period, the European Declaration, and crucially, the Geneva Convention on the rights of people to seek asylum. We need to go a bit further than just saying we support them. We need to make sure our legislation incorporates all aspects of those very significant declarations. But we also need to make sure that our trade policies and trade treaties and trading arrangements are also serious about human rights. So we don't sell arms to people that are using those very weapons to shoot at trade unionists and others who are demonstrating on the streets. That we do have trade treaties that guarantee that we are doing our best to ensure observation of all those declarations in whatever country we're trading with. It's not easy. Because when money and human rights come together, money too often wins. Surely it's our principles as a Labour Party and a Labour movement that stand up for the Universal Declaration, stand up for the rights of free speech, of assembly, of religious freedoms, and all the other freedoms that are so important. Because there are also lessons to be learned. Injustice, unresolved, feeds a cycle of injustice that can dim our humanity. Anger of people removed from any political system, any rights, leads them into some very difficult and bad places. So I want us to be a party where human rights is central to what we do and what we believe in, and a Labour government in 2020 that is seen as serious and total in its commitment to human rights across the whole globe in everything that we do. Now, I don't do any kind of personal abuse, and I don't make it, and I don't respond to it, because if I did, I wouldn't have time to do anything else in my life, because there's only so many hours in a day. Abuse is quite simply unacceptable, and we're right to condemn it. But we must also understand it sometimes is understandable but unjustifiable, that frustration at having lost an argument. But too often, it's a sign of powerlessness. When people feel their argument is not even being listened to, when people don't see any hopes of injustice being addressed. So it's our job to reach out to people, our job to work together, organise together, to bring about solutions to injustice that has happened. But to behave in a way within our movement that is respect for all and doesn't allow that kind of cheap abuse to happen in any form of society. And so I'm very proud of the work that we've done already on mental health, with our appointment of Luciana Berger as our Shadow Secretary of State for Mental Health. That has helped to change the narrative, change the discourse, change the discussion, and I believe helped to force the government into providing insufficient but a bit more money for our mental health services. We as a movement are very big. We can be very proud of what we're doing and many of the things that we have already achieved. One of the great injustices, acutely in London, but in every major city, is the housing crisis. This morning, I was at a demonstration in my constituency, people protesting about the lack of supply of council housing and the way in which the previous Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, took no real interest in the opportunities provided by the few remaining big sites that can be built on in London of providing housing for people that need it. Instead, he has allowed the property market to dominate everything. We need a strategy and a policy that is housing for all. And I want to thank John Healey for the work that he's done already as Shadow Housing Minister, and the work that I know Sadiq and Marvin and the other mayors will be doing to set us examples of how you can build good quality council housing, how you can regulate the private rented sector, and how you can chase down the idea that all that matters in housing, which is as far as the government is concerned, is selling off high-value council housing, having short-term tenancies for council housing, and allowing the property market to deliberately keep vacant luxury flats as an investment for the future, whilst there are people sleeping on the streets or children growing up in grossly overcrowded accommodation. It's a moral purpose and a moral cause that we as a Labour government in 2020 have to say we wish to end homelessness and end overcrowding within the lifetime of that first Labour government after that election. I've met many people who are angry with the way our welfare system treated them, and also felt that we as a party haven't always stood up for the principles of the welfare state and the principles of support and benefits for people going through a time of stress. I think we should be proud of the fundamental achievements of the post-war Labour government, obviously within the National Health Service, but also within the principles surrounding the welfare state. But in opposition, you can achieve some things. We were resolute in our opposition to the cuts in working tax credits, which would have come in last month. We opposed it in the Commons. Many people organised demonstrations and meetings and petitions about it outside, a big presence on social media of opposition to it, and eventually, and thank you to our colleagues in the House of Lords, we managed to defeat that proposal, which meant that 3 million families have not been robbed of £1,000 per year because of Labour's action in Parliament. That's practical, defensive action to support those people, and I'm proud of the way that our party performed to do that. Likewise, we managed to defeat the cuts to personal independence payments, which George Osborne mysteriously shoved in the budget about halfway through and eventually, out of sheer embarrassment, took it out 3 days later. But what a disgraceful state of affairs that a Chancellor of the Exchequer should stick in a budget that enormous cut of £4 billion in total from people with disabilities and then be so ashamed that they took it away. The anger that people felt, the stress that those in receipt of that benefit felt because of the way they're treated was palpable in those days afterwards. We're not done yet because they're still trying to cut ESA payments for those with disabilities. But we are standing up and sticking up on that. When there's a real combination of us making a presence in the media, a big presence in the social media, a big presence in every shopping centre in the country, and what we do in Parliament, we can make a difference. And so our party is never without influence, whether it's the injustice the Tories are doing on dodgy deals over Saudi prisons, or the way in which Alf Dubs and Yvette and others have forced the government into a retreat on child refugees by allowing 3,000 child refugees to come into Britain. And I absolutely agree with what Alison said at the beginning of this. These are unaccompanied child minors stuck in horrible conditions in various places across Europe. I simply say this: the refugee crisis across Europe has its origins in the conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, yes, and all of those require political solutions, because at the end of the day, that's what has to happen. But you're not going to solve the refugee crisis across Europe with CS gas, with barbed wire, with electronic surveillance and gunboats. You're only going to solve it with humanity and reaching out to people in need. Those refugees are just like you and just like me, simply trying to survive. Let's have a moral purpose on this. however many campaigning victories we win, and we have won a few, and I hope we're going to win quite a few more as time goes on, the reality is we don't have a majority in Parliament, we don't have a Labour government. I want us to have that and to win that in 2020. Or if David Cameron feels like it, we can have it a bit sooner. We can send him that message. I'm sure we're all agreed on that. The elections last week were very interesting. We were a long way behind the Tories a year ago. This time we were ahead of the Tories at the outcome of this. We won seats in Wales that we lost in 2015. We held councils that we'd lost in the past. And above all, we held or gained councils in areas where there are Conservative MPs and Conservative power. Now, I wanted us to do better. Of course I did. But almost half of all council elections held at the beginning of May resulted in a Labour councillor being elected for those wards. I congratulate all of them on the results that they achieved. I thank all party members and all supporters that united together to achieve those victories, both in the spectacular mayoral elections, but also the council election results all over the country. I visited a very large number of places in campaigning, and what totally impressed me was the large number of party members coming out. We had, for example, 600 turned out on a Thursday afternoon in Milton Keynes to go out canvassing. At least they all told me they were going to go out canvassing at the end of the meeting. I'm sure they all did. But to get that number there, I think, is an impressive start. But we win in 2020 if we mobilise and organise. We have 400,000 members. We have 3 million affiliated trade union members. We have well over 100,000, I think it is, registered supporters of our party. And where we have high turnouts, as we did in Exeter, Bristol and London, for example, we won and the Labour vote was up. I've only been in this position for 8 months. I want to see us, our party, even bigger, even stronger, but above all united in the fundamental determination to challenge the economic strategy of this government, to challenge the idea that austerity is somehow or other something that's necessary. In reality, it's a political choice that's been made to roll back the state. It's a political choice that's been made which is damaging the lives of so many people. We achieve winning by an inclusive politics that involves more people. Combining together, we challenge it, and we challenge the economic narrative that's been in operation in the West for quite a long time, going back to Reaganomics of the 1970s, that all that mattered was rolling back the state, privatising services, cutting provision, and making the next generation worse off than the present generation, and the generation after that even worse off. I ask myself this question: if I was brought up to believe that my generation was going to be better off than my parents' generation, we would have more opportunities in education, we would have better health care, we would have real social security, we would have those opportunities and employment opportunities. What's changed? What's changed? Is the world a poorer place? Is technology gone backwards? Has the ability to make things, to learn things, to do things gone backwards? Or is it we've been sold a narrative that all that really matters is the individual getting much richer and the very richest individuals becoming super rich and living in tax havens and all the rest of it, while the rest see a rollback of the role of public services in education, in health, in housing, and in social security, and the next generation having to pay even more than this one and be even more indebted than the current generation of young people coming out of university and college. These are huge questions. These are huge questions that the left as a whole has to face. Has to face those questions about how we campaign for that inclusive community idea, but also how we campaign to ensure that the brilliance of all the new technologies around doesn't result in concentration of wealth in the hands of the few and poverty for the many and short-term or no working whatsoever for the rest of them. They are huge issues that we have to face as a movement. Our party is big. Our party has wonderful traditions. Our party has people of unbelievable levels of brilliance. Working together, they can achieve a great deal. A democratic policy-making process that everyone feels part of and can come into is a very important step forward on that. These are really exciting times for politics in this country, across Europe, and in the United States, as we challenge the legacy of the strategy of Thatcher and Reagan that they laid down in the 1970s to bring forward a more inclusive, more confident future that does have humanitarian instincts at its core, that does have environmental protection at its core, but does have at its central theme the inclusivity that everybody in society actually matters, and we shouldn't walk by on the other side because somebody has been so badly treated they end up sleeping rough on the streets and become just a statistic. They're not. They're a human being, just like you and just like me, who deserve to be treated properly and with respect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy. Now, we've not got a vast amount of time, so I'm going...
I've got to go and congratulate the candidate for tooting.
Yes, and
whoever it is.
We'd all better get out on the knocker to make sure they get elected. Everyone's going to do that.
Canvassing starts at 4 o'clock.
Okay, so I'm going to take just a couple of questions. I will just look. Okay, the lady there in the black jacket, okay, Merseyside Loyalties, Paul Brandt over there. So the lady there and Paul at the front here. We'll take a couple and then see how we go on. We might have a moment for a couple more after that. Please, could you say who you are and where you come from?
Rachel Bergin. I'm from North East Herts CLP. My family's from the old West Cumberland coalfield. They've been Labour since probably the days of Keir Hardie. And have been involved in the Labour wider movement since its inception. But when I go back to those communities that are 400 miles away from here, there's a real palpable frustration at the disconnect between their everyday lives and decisions by policymakers being made in what they perceive to be a detached Westminster bubble. And my question is, what do you, as Labour leader, plan to do to bridge that 400-mile gap?
Cool. Paul?
Thanks. Paul Brandt, Deputy Leader of the Labour Group in Liverpool. Welcome, Jeremy. During your speech, someone tweeted that they think they'd have got better odds on Leicester winning the league than seeing the PU in front of a Progress banner there, but it's very much welcome that you're here today. I think everybody in the room is very appreciative of the fact that we've had a vigorous debate, and one of the great things about your leadership campaign was that you welcomed the opportunity for us to have a proper debate within the party. And it is unfortunate that some of the debate that's happening in the party is sometimes done in an intemperate and intolerant language. The fact that you're here today is a counterpoint to those kind of people who want to divide us in the party. We certainly don't see ourselves as a far-right group. We are a mainstream Labour Party group, and indeed we are a broad church in the Labour Party.
Okay.
I think
we need to get more questions in.
Yes, sorry. Would you agree that your leadership campaign, today's meeting, shows that we can in the party disagree without being disagreeable?
Okay.
Thanks for the questions, Rachel. Good point. Post the mining industry, the Tory government didn't invest anything like the money it should have done in the coalfield communities, had no plan for continuation of work, very little plan for putting industry there or anything else. And indeed, the closing down of the coal industry was largely a political decision anyway, as we well know, and that disconnect is absolutely there, and I pick that up all the time. It's not simple. The strengths of the party locally can help. The strength of local authorities locally can help with planning to bring jobs and opportunities into those places. And that leads me on to the issue of devolution and of rights at work. On devolution, we'll be appointing a constitutional commission very soon, which will be designed to look at two broad areas. One will be the question of parliamentary powers in the House of Lords and the need for democracy in the upper house. That, I think, we'd all agree on is very important. Secondly, we're going to inherit in 2020 a system of executive mayors covering more than one local authority area, which concerns me because I think there should be a direct line of accountability. And there's a need for a really inclusive form of pressure from the grassroots on how local authority decisions are made and economic planning is made. Because we don't have a properly devolved system in Britain, we have a massive imbalance in infrastructure investment. If you look, for example, at rail transport investment, very high in London and the southeast, basically pretty low in all other parts of the country, and still huge levels of underinvestment all across the north and particularly in the East Midlands. You look at the southwest, south of Bristol, Gloucester and down towards Penzance, again, inadequate transport networks, therefore very difficult to develop much industry or jobs there because of that, and indeed that's become the low-pay capital of the country. So devolution is important, and economic planning at a more localised level is important, but don't fall for the Tory trap, which talks about devolution of tax income to local authorities, which actually will lead to far greater imbalances in our society. There has to be a central balancing act by central government to ensure proper allocation of funds to particular regions. And so I absolutely get that. And in the economic policy discussions that John and Seema and their teams are having going around the country, we're developing these sort of town and city-wide meetings where you look at the economy that's there, look at the economy that could be there, and look at the powers that are needed by the appropriate local authorities to bring about better economic opportunities for everybody. Otherwise, you end up with depopulation and a huge degree of misery and cynicism within those communities. On workplace issues, next week on Thursday, we're launching Workplace 2020, which will be a campaign supported by TUC and unions and many others about rights at work, about regulation of work, about opportunities of work, about trade union rights and trade union legislation, both the current bill that's going through, but also other pieces of legislation that's going through. But it will also involve the question of the rights of self-employed workers, who can often be actually as badly or as equally exploited as underpaid people in insecure jobs in the workplace. That Workplace 2020 will be launched next Thursday. Look out for it. Please join in it and give your ideas and views to it. Because again, that's going to be running for a good while in order to ensure that we get a big diversity and range of employment issues raised, particularly discrimination, gender pay gap, and opportunities for young people. On the point that you raised about the chances of Leicester or me being elected, I'm not quite sure, because Leicester did pretty well, actually. But I hope there's good news from Arsenal in the Women's Cup final at the moment. Yes, I do welcome the fact there's a proper debate within the party. And as I said, I sometimes read the papers and I realise that people say really unkind things about me. They really are quite rude, actually, some of them. I don't care, because I'm not, as you said about Sadiq's campaign, I'm not getting in the gutter with those people. Because once you start throwing about personal abuse and replying to it, after a very short time, A said something nasty to B, C said something nasty to A, X said something really vile about B, and A responded. The public are totally lost by that stage. All they hear is squabbling politicians. Don't do it. Don't get involved in it. And that abuse should not be played out online either. I know that it's very tempting when you're in a pub at night and you've had a few jars to send out a tweet that you rather regret. In the old days, people used to just say things in a pub that was often forgotten. These days, they feel the need to put it on their mobile phone immediately. It's not a good idea. Don't do it. And just remember that if we, as a movement, appear like we're not capable of having a political debate only about being abusive to each other, it's not very attractive. It doesn't bring people in. It doesn't make us stronger. It doesn't make our ideas more credible. It has absolutely the opposite effect. Treat people as you would wish to be treated yourself. That's my maxim.
Do as you would be done by. The lady straight ahead of me there in the in red, and oh goodness me, this is really tough. Gonna try and go for somebody at the back. Okay, right at the back, over there on to my right. I've confused myself. With the red hair, straight ahead of here. Please.
Hello.
Hi.
Despite being a BME woman, I find that probably the smallest minority I'm in this party is that I work for the private sector.
Did you hear that?
I didn't get her name.
And yet most of the working people in Britain are employed by the private sector. And I do think that at the last election, a lot of them felt that Labour didn't really understand them, was a bit hostile to entrepreneurship, and was actively hostile to the people that actually gave them jobs. So I was just wondering whether you had any ideas about how we reconnect with business and all it has to offer.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Kyla Fulcher, Islington North, CLP. How are you doing, Jeremy?
You're from Islington North?
Yeah.
Well, they're allowed to ask questions.
No, I know, but...
Hang on, I'm not getting discrimination against Islington North here.
It's even worse. I'm actually from the same branch as Jeremy, so hopefully I'll see you in the pub soon. I just want to be quite niche. The biggest single issue that I think we can have the biggest success policy-wise on, perhaps in the next few years, is the living wage. It's a policy that's supported by most of the public, and the government, while they've created a national living wage, everyone here knows that it is no way, and it's nothing near the actual living wage, which is based on the cost of living. It's £1 short across the whole country, and it's £2 short in London. So my question is, how are you going to keep up the pressure on the government to introduce something that gives people enough to live on?
Okay. Thanks. I'll take those two questions. First of all, I didn't get your name, actually. Oh, fine. Welcome. Thanks very much. Yes, you're right. The majority of people in work do work in the private sector, not the public sector. And the unions are strongest largely in the public sector rather than the private sector. And that probably leads to a degree of representation influence within the party. How do we reach out on these issues? In a number of ways. One is Workplace 2020 will obviously be looking at issues of, as I said, wage rates, rights of work, health and safety requirements, particularly in small enterprises and small companies where they're often the worst, and the levels of discrimination and lack of fair employment practice the worst. But it's also reaching out and working with and corresponding with the organisations that represent them. I have been in contact with the British Chambers of Commerce. I spoke at their conference. I spoke there about the importance and value of having a national investment bank which would be able to help young businesses and new businesses get going, and particularly entrepreneurs trying to develop new products and new ideas. Because what so often happens in this country is somebody would develop a very clever app for a computer, perhaps, or develop some very clever form of plastic polymer coatings, a whole lot of things people might do, often developed in our universities, where these things are often done very well. Then, as they grow, they need some capital to invest in new equipment and new plant. They can't get it. The banks don't trust them. The banks don't give them a very good credit rating, don't give them the support and help that they should need. Therefore, a hedge fund comes along, buys up the company, buys up the idea, often outsources the production somewhere else, and the gains are not as good as they could be for our society as a whole. So I do think we have to reach out in that way, which is why the economic conversations we're having around the country do involve the way in which private sector businesses can develop, do involve trade unions within the private sector, and do involve working with the Chamber of Commerce. And yes, I've had meetings also with the CBI and will continue to do so, because yes, I do believe there is a need for interventionist government. I do believe government should reach out. I do believe that government should be prepared when necessary to take a stake in industry and to be involved in industrial planning. But clearly, there is a huge private sector, and there's always going to be a huge private sector, and you have to work with that and ensure that the wage levels are appropriate as well as the conditions at work. On your point about the living wage, you're absolutely right. When we campaigned for a national minimum wage, it was just totally rejected by the Tories, and eventually we won and we got the national minimum wage. The campaign then developed, which pointed out the national living wage was actually not the minimum wage. You needed to pay more to get a national living wage, and many colleagues around the country worked very hard on achieving that. The government then grasped the language but didn't give us the money, basically, and so they've created a living wage that is not a living wage. And this week I did call it a corruption of language by the government, which David Cameron didn't listen to properly and thought I was calling him corrupt. I was actually calling the system wrong, which I believe it to be. Many have campaigned for a real living wage. Indeed, in our own constituency, we campaigned for Arsenal to pay the living wage, and eventually we won that campaign, as indeed many have won it around the country. We have to keep up the pressure on it. It may be we've got to finesse the language in some way, because it becomes quite complicated when you say, well, we want a real living wage, theirs isn't really a real living wage. Maybe we've got to think of some way of representing it. But I want to keep on to that all the way through to 2020. And an incoming Labour government to be measured against its achievements in housing, in inequality, in wage levels, in living standards. So we actually measure economic growth and economic achievement on the basis of the improvement of the real living standards of the worst off as well as the median within our society. So thanks for your question. And it's great to have you in Islington North. It's a wonderful place. But take one more then.
Can I persuade you to take one more round?
One more, then I better finish,
okay.
Joe, because tooting Beckons.
Right, okay. Let's go for the gentleman right there who's in the white shirt just there. And very, very briefly, Arjun there. But you both are under strict instructions to be really quick. Okay, go.
Hello, can anybody hear me?
Just shout, just shout.
Jeremy, my name's Peter. I'm from West London. I'm a Jewish Labour activist. We've gone through a really grueling period in London trying to get City Khan elected in what's been for Jewish Labour supporters an atmosphere of real poison over anti-Semitism within the party, especially given Ken Livingstone's incendiary comments that he deliberately made on national television. Do you accept that the Labour Party has a particular and specific problem with anti-Semitism? And as each of us work towards getting Labour elected in 2020, how are you going to demonstrate, as the leader of our party, to the Jewish community, for whom have for the vast majority of whom have a fundamental connection with Israel, just like other diaspora communities do in this country, that the Labour Party is on their side and that they can be confident and comfortable in voting for us?
Cool. And just because I went to campaign with him in East Finchley and we won, Arjun.
Thank you. And we got the best result in Barnet in East Finchley. Peter's actually nicked my question, so I'm going to expand it very quickly to a...
Very quickly.
We actually do need a plan for all of our communities in Britain. Obviously, I have a particular concern as a Barnet council about the Jewish community. But certainly in North London, we were losing the Hindu community, got problems with the Chinese community, and I'm sure in every other part of Britain, you know, there are communities we're losing, moving away from. So can you make sure we strengthen our appeal to those minority communities? Thank you.
Peter and Arjun, thank you very much for your questions. Anti-Semitism is wrong and has to be totally opposed and totally defeated, period. Okay? I'm obviously fully aware of the reports and allegations that have been made. Members have been suspended for investigation on this, and I decided that the best thing to do to deal with the whole issue was to appoint Shami Chakrabarti and David Letterman to set up a commission of inquiry, which they've done. It will report in less than 2 months. It's taking evidence now. The terms of reference are there for all to see. The participation is already quite considerable, and I hope it will continue to be. And out of that will come a substantial report, will come a recommendation on process within the party, and will come, I hope, a recommendation that we have a specific rule change, declaration, that's something like that, on absolutely a totally anti-racist position in all aspects of our party and our movement and our lives, so that we live by what we all believe in, a society where you recognise diversity, you don't criticise or condemn people for their faith, their ethnicity, or their beliefs, and we have that kind of strength in our community. The point you're making about reaching out to all communities, I absolutely agree with it. I'm very proud to represent a very mixed community. There are probably 60 or more languages spoken in my constituency. There are people from all over the world and all parts of the United Kingdom. And as a party locally, we make sure we reach out to all of those communities. As a party, we have begun to reach out better with different groupings like Chinese for Labour, Africans for Labour, and other groups like that. That's important. That's got to go on. And I hope that that will be something we'll do in a much more effective, open and stronger way. And certainly I am making sure I reach out to every community by meeting them, visiting them, working with them and discussing with them the issues that they deal with. And the Black and Minority Ethnic Labour Group executive is coming to meet me in my office to have a discussion about how we take these things forward, as well as all the other good celebrations that we do. But it's also about chasing down racism in any form, discrimination in our society, Islamophobia, far-right racism, all the rest of it. Racism is simply wrong. It divides us, not unites us. That is why the far right are so dangerous all across Europe, because their only answer to the economic issues facing people across Europe is to divide people on ethnic grounds, whereas we unite people on the basis of the interests of working class people in coming together to achieve things together. It's strength that brings achievements. It's division and disunity that brings defeat for all of us in the end. Thank you for your question.